when you said that you were interested to come on and speak to us, I was just thrilled. I was over the moon. We're big fans of your playing, and for me, it's very special because I came from California to New York, specifically to NYU, to try to get to hang and study with you, John, and it did.
My God, Perry, that's so nice because I love your playing, and all you guys are great. So I feel equally honored to be here talking to you guys, super shredders, each and all, and every one.
This is high praise coming from you, John. Well, it did not disappoint. It was incredibly inspiring getting to hang with you, and one of the many things that I admire about your playing and your artistry is that you've really honed your sound over the years, mainly through this one instrument, through the semi-hollow Ibanez, the old AS200 model. Now, of course, you have your own models. But my first question for you was just to ask you, what was it about the semi-hollow that really drew you in versus a 175 or a Tele? What was it about the semi-hollow model that connected to what you were trying to do? Because you've been playing it since the 80s, right? Even maybe before that.
Before then. Well, it's kind of weird, because when I started out and went to Berkeley, I bought a 175, just like the one that's in back of you right now.
Oh, wow.
And
okay.
I still have it. It's from 1968. And that was my, jazz guitar that I was going to be a jazz guitarist on. Actually, the first record I ever made was with Jerry Mulligan. I was still playing that. And right at that time, I got a gig with Billy Cobham's band, which was a loud electric fusion band. So I said, I know my 175 is not going to make it. At that point, I got a 330 that worked for about a month. And even then, I had taped it up and everything. And then I went over to this Les Paul Jr. that I bought. I traded the 330 for a Les Paul Jr. And I was rocking out on that because I had started out with a solid body guitar as a kid. And then I just felt like there was something in between, and being a B.B. King fan for years and knowing about semi-acoustics, I at the end of the Billy Cobham thing, when I was still playing loud gigs, I thought it would be the proper interim thing between, a solid body and a hollow body. And I've just stuck with it. I'm not sure why. I guess I just like to play loud all the time, and it works.
I've heard kind of interesting story about how you got connected with the Ibanez people. I was wondering if you could talk about that. I think you were on the road. It was just in Japan, and they showed up at the gig or something. Can you talk a little bit about that moment when?
Exactly. Yeah, it was. I was on the road with Teru Masahino, a great Japanese trumpet player's band, in 1982, and I had my 335 Gibson. And at that point, I didn't know how to do neck adjustments. I didn't trust myself.
Yeah.
Steve Swallow had already broken my guitar once.
Oh my
by
God.
trying to do a neck adjustment, and my neck was bent, and I was playing it with a ridiculously high action, no pun intended, because of the warp,
Yeah.
And Ibanez came to a gig in Nagoya and handed me this guitar. I said, "You want to play this? We'll give it to you." And it was this beautiful AS200 that I still play, and I just started playing it, and I still play it often today. I have two AS200s. The 335, I adjusted the neck, and that's still a good guitar too. I'm starting to think it doesn't matter what guitar you play as long as it's a good guitar.
Yeah.
It turns out,
Yeah.
I mean, Tellies and 175s are completely different worlds, and 335 is a completely different world. Of course, there are those sonic differences, but there's so much more that's more important about making music, and jazz especially. It's one thing if you want a chimey sound for a rhythm part on a track or something, and then you would play that kind of guitar. But just, I don't know. And sometimes I have these recordings where I play another guitar, like a Strat or a Telly, and people would think it sounds exactly the same as my 335s. So I don't know.
So who knows? Well, you've developed an incredible sound on it. Whether you're playing loud or whether you're playing quiet, some of the interactions we had at NYU, I remember you playing at a pretty low volume, and it sounded amazing. So I think whatever you've been able to do on that guitar, it's phenomenal.
You just get used to a guitar, and then I think you have to play a guitar for a long time to see what it can do too.
I agree. I mean, I've been playing this 175. It was since about 98, just off the rack at Guitar Center, and put a few custom things on it, a new bridge, but I've certainly learned a lot about that guitar over the years from playing it, and developed my own playing through that guitar. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your career towards the beginning. You have such a truly prolific career. At this point, it's over 40 years. You've played with just about everybody. Your recording catalog is amazing, and I'm always curious to ask players about sort of some of the influential moments early on in their career. And I know you were at Berklee School of Music in Boston, and quickly made your way down to New York and started playing with a lot of people. And this sort of relates to one of the themes we have in this podcast, which is about collaborations, the great musical collaborations people have had. John Story and I started this group 15 years ago, and it's been a really important collaboration for us. Will joined about 5 or 6 years ago and has elevated the group to new levels. And so, the collaborations that you have with musicians are so important. And I think it was a mid to late 70s, you met Steve Swallow, and I know that's been a really important musical collaboration. You still play with him today. Your most recent release on ECM is Swallow Tales, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit about meeting Steve Swallow and how that collaboration and relationship has influenced you throughout your career.
Sure. I agree with you. I think music's a collaborative thing. That's what I miss the most in quarantine, is getting out and playing with my friends. I really, really miss it. There's a camaraderie and a thing that we do together that I've just been used to. This is the longest I've been home in 40 years.
I know.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I feel lucky that, not to sound like an old man here, but I am 68. So, when I started out, there were more gigs, just more chances to play live. Most of them really were awful, little local bar gigs where you were forced to play, crappy music for drunk people. But it was a way to make a living. Jazz gigs were never readily available, but there were more, it seems. It's been this great, wonderful thing to get to know and play with all these great musicians. That's been the best part about playing is the people thing and the inspiration that great musicians give you.
Absolutely.
And one of the first great musicians I met was Steve Swallow. I had Berklee right after high school, so I started in 1970. I was trying to learn jazz and all, and Gary Burton came to teach there after I'd already been there a year. And Gary Burton was a big star. I couldn't believe, what's this guy doing coming to teach at Berklee? I couldn't believe it. But because I was a fan of his. All guitar players at that point were fans, I think, of the Gary Burton Quartet, which had Larry Coryell and then had Sam Brown, and Jerry Hahn, and all these great players had come through the band. So I'd seen him live, and Steve had always been the bassist, Steve Swallow.
Okay.
I had one of the first jazz records I got as a high school kid was Art Farmer Live at the Half Note featuring Jim Hall. Steve Swallow was the bass player on there, which is still one of my favorite albums. You know, I knew about Steve's music from all these records that he was on. Then Gary came to teach at Berkeley, and my roommates were a really good drummer named Ted Siebes, who gave up music, I guess, but he was way better than the rest of us. He was kind of already the best drummer at Berkeley, and a really good bassist, Chip Jackson. We were all kids, and we roomed together. We had a set of vibes at the apartment. So Gary wanted to play with this drummer because he was a good kid. Gary would come over like every day after school and wait for the traffic to subside, and we would play tunes with him, you know, and unfortunately, you know, somebody would pass me a joint, and every time I would take a couple of tokes, and then I'd be, you know, paranoid and crazed. So here I was playing with a real professional jazz musician, and I'm stoned out of my gut. It's stupid. But anyway, this was a great, great experience to play with Gary. And after, I guess it was after a year, he got Steve Swallow to come teach at Berkeley. Swallow had moved to the West Coast, so he wasn't in Gary's band anymore.
Okay.
But he came to Berkeley and started to teach there and joined Gary's band again. And I met Steve. And Steve had a shared apartment down the street. You know, I dropped out of school after 2 years because I wanted to just play. And like I said, there were enough crappy gigs that I could just play, not jazz gigs, but whatever, and get by, you know. And I got to know Steve a little bit. We started to play together. And that was 1973, I think, or 72 maybe even. He's been, you know, a teacher, friend. He's just a really wonderful person, you know, so we hit it off. These are the guys that I learned so much from because they were already 10 years older than me, Gary and Steve and these guys that I met early on. And they've been through the whole deal, you know. I mean, Steve, you know, man, he had to play with Monk one night. He played with Jim Hall a lot. You know, he knew Jim really well. Wow. And he played with Jimmy Jufrin. He made one of the greatest free jazz kind of records of all time, Paul Bley, Footloose. And you know, so he'd done all this stuff, and here he was, and I got to know him, and he was just starting to play electric bass. So he was kind of interested in guitar, you know, so we had a guitar friendship because he was checking out electric bass and wanted to make that his only instrument.
Well, his compositions are incredible. His melodic way of playing is incredible. I know that it must have really meant a lot to you. You still play with him these days in your trio with Bill, and it's one of my favorite trios, and the new record sounds really, really cool. So for people who haven't checked it out, go online, find it however you find your music, and it's Swallow Tales out on ECM. Really great album. So thank you for putting that out in the world and featuring his tunes.
It was great to, you know, I've also known Steve as a composer before I even met him. Because when we started to play with Gary Burton, he gave us all the lead sheets to the songs that his band played. It was kind of the Gary Burton songbook. A lot of those were Swallow's tunes. So I've been playing those tunes since I was in my early 20s. And they're hard, you know, it's a good chord progression, right? You can spend years with.
Yeah, something like Falling Grace is, you know, still can be a challenge for me to really get into the harmony on that. It's a great tune.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Marchione Guitars, handcrafted instruments made by luthier extraordinaire Stephen Marchione. I have two of his guitars. I have the 59 semi-hollow, and I have the OM acoustic. They play amazing. They sound like nothing else. Completely resonant across the whole body. Wide frets, just so many overtones, so much beautiful sound coming out of these instruments. All made personally by Stephen by hand. Check them out at marchioneguitars.com.
Well, I wanted to ask one other question before I pass it off to John Story and Will Brom here. One of the things that you talk about a lot that made a real impression on me as a jazz guitarist was this notion that you can't help but sound like yourself. And I think it's an important sort of phrase to remember, that you might be influenced by a lot of people and transcribing things and maybe have other artists in your head when you're playing occasionally, but that ultimately you're going to end up sounding like yourself. And so you might as well embrace who you are as a player, truly. Now, you are the greatest example of that, in my opinion. You have such an incredible style all to your own. And I'm curious to ask you, what are some of the things that over your career you feel like you've done, or maybe some things that you didn't do that helped you kind of embrace your own way of playing and embrace the things about you that make you who you are as a player?
Well, I guess the first